time has really come for us to undergo collectively a quantum leap.
People have asked me, so what's next? And I really believe it's this great listening.
How do you manage different people effectively?
What if we think of spirituality at work not as the answer, but as the question, or in philosophical terms, as the inquiry, which is the ongoing question?
Imagine that a decade from now that it'll be required that the CEOs of visionary and progressive companies will be spiritual leaders.
In HP, at one point, my job was a kind of quality manager job to make our research lab the best in the world. And so we went around and benchmarked and improved a bunch of things and fixed a bunch of things. And it all got pretty boring. And I started talking to people. I was horrified that it was boring because it was my job. And I said, you know, what would make this exciting? Why would you want to do this job? Why would you want to come to work? And my friend Lori Middlestad, who's one of our engineers, came in one day and she said, you know, I've been thinking about that question. She said, you know what I would get up in the morning for? I get up to be the best for the world. Best in the world, who cares? Best for the world, that's what I want to do. And we started talking about that in many conversations. We had a town forum with all 1,000 employees going, best for the world, what would that mean? And people who had never even asked a question in a coffee talk were pouring out their anguish for the world. Many of the people in our companies come from the parts of the world that are suffering, and they're in the closet about it because we've not been interested. And just that little tweak, best in the world, best for the world. And I think, you know, spirit in business, for what? Well, you know, in the beginning it was used for stress reduction. You know, meditate, you're not so stressed. Good. That's good. It's good not to be stressed. And now it's like, now what? You know, now what is spirit in business for? And what if business were for the world? What if, you know, doing well and doing good not only weren't mutually exclusive, what if they were perfectly coincident? Not just the overlap between two circles that have come together and have a little bit of overlap in a Venn diagram, but what if they were the same space? That what you did to do well, to make a profit, was good. Always, or you didn't do it. I mean, I think that's what spirit in business is for now. We started as stardust 15 billion years ago, and over time evolved into all the myriad of life forms that have ever been and are now. And our own species has precipitated a decline of such vast proportions. We're at really the most incredible moment in history, because it could be the end of human history at any moment. I mean, there are rogue nuclear bombs loose, we know that. Diseases barely kept in the refrigerator with the lids on. And at the same time, there is a growing yearning across the species to get over the things that divide us and the things that are standing in the way of the great leap forward, the leap forward that we're capable of. It is possible our children or our children's children could one day go through the museum of the worst days and point to the worst things that are going on and ask us about them. And we could tell them, you know, how we moved past starvation and disease and the huge vast, exponentially increasing abyss between the haves and the have-nots. We have it in us to close that gap. I'm finding that the conversation we need to be having now is not a conversation in the traditional sense. It's a gigantic listening. I think that a certain number of us, for the sake of the whole, need to be spending 80% of our time in meditation and listening. And that's very difficult to do if you have a full-time job. But to the extent, and I do have friends with spiritual practices about repose in action and meditation while on the move. And I think we've got to get better at that, because I think that it's not clear what's wanting to happen, and therefore what the one next step would be, for me personally, or for my company, for the corporate sector. I think there's a deep listening required, and I think we need to do it together. I think collectively there's a group that almost across the planet needs to be listening and in communion with each other about what are you hearing, you know, what is possible here now that wasn't possible before. But what we think we're about in producing computers or drugs, medicines, or books, or any of it, may in fact be the excuse for the real contribution to civilization, which is the artifact of all these little mini economies, which are made up of the whole world. I mean, 160 nationalities inside one company. I mean, what's that about? What do we know that the world needs to know about working together? And how could we migrate that DNA out in a way that helped? What we want to really begin to think through and leverage is our companies as diverse communities unified in action to produce the results that have the S&P rising 300%. And people say, you know, well, doesn't this have to start at the top? Or doesn't this have to be a grassroots movement? It has to be a fractal that shows up at every level. And key to it is understanding that our corporations are communities. They are living systems. And the most important tool for me is remember who you work for. That is always the one I come back to. And it's very confusing in organizations because we get confused and think that we work for the person in the box on top of our head on the org chart. And my experience has been that whenever I default to working for that box, I am 1% of my magnificence on a good day. When I remember who I work for, a strange thing happens. Everybody on the org chart suddenly reports to me, including the CEO. So we used to teach these values in schools, in the family, in churches, synagogues, mosques. And the question is, where are these values being taught now? And I definitely think business is one of the places. That is where a lot of people are learning tolerance and learning, you know, how to be curious in a way that builds community. And what Jerry did, based on an esoteric article he read while he was a dean at Harvard, is he thought, what if we go into these starving communities and look at who isn't starving? Let's go in and weigh all the children and see which children aren't starving, because every community has a few. And then let's go into inquiry as a community to understand why these children aren't starving. So that's what he did. They weighed the kids and you know, the workers. He said, these children that aren't starving, why aren't they starving? Well, this one has a rich uncle in America who sends food over. Okay, leave them off the list. You winnow it down to the few kids that aren't starving, whose families have only what everybody else has. And then you go into understanding, how is this possible? Because they're getting the same amount of rice as everybody else, and yet most of the community's starving and a few aren't. And you follow them down to the river and you realize that when they pick their rice, their handful of rice, they're also adding the shrimp that live in the water, the tiny shrimp that custom has you weed out, only these people don't follow the custom, and they're throwing in the river weeds by the side of the banks. And so their children are getting protein and minerals and vitamins, and that's why the kids aren't starving. So you take this indigenous solution, and the neighbors that are doing that for the food teach the others. And overnight, the entire community can feed its own children without foreign aid. You know, when you think about it, our global companies are microcosms of a world that could work. We've got every nationality represented. We have people on project teams in many of our companies, I know mine, whose countries of origin are at war. You know, who go home and tune in to, the satellite TV news station to learn how the people at home are killing, the people at home for somebody else on the team. Now, how is it and what do we know about getting together and working together that we can do inside the company that we could take out? And I think one of the things that we know is that in the service of a common purpose, people get over themselves. And the more exciting that purpose, the more worthy it is, the more we'll get over. People have asked me, so what's next? And I really believe it's this great listening. And having done the very barest, most shallowest listening possible at this point, I think that we're at a real pivot point in the evolution of the corporation. Do we fall back to the mechanical model, the mechanistic model of the early industrial age, where workers are cogs in a machine and expendable, and this drive for the next quarter for Wall Street has us laying off tens of thousands? Or do we leap forward to understanding that each of these little ecosystems, which is a mirror of a world that could work, integrating all this diversity and all these nationalities and value systems and ages and traditions together, that in effect is really a community and needs to be honored as a community and needs to be developed as a community. A friend of mine who's a planetary biologist, Elizabeth Satoris, tells the most wonderful story of life and its possibilities. And one of her descriptions of life as it actually occurs is as the caterpillar morphs into a butterfly. Caterpillar is going along doing caterpillar life, munching away on the leaves, and in its body appear the imaginal cells for butterfly. And the caterpillar immune system kills them off. They're strange. Butterflies don't belong in worms. And this goes on until the imaginal cells get it that they have to hook up, and hook up robustly, and form a lattice that the immune system then cannot overcome. And that is the beginning of butterfly. And I feel that is where we are as a species. And there's a point in that metamorphosis where the entity is neither butterfly nor caterpillar, but rather a kind of bio-soup, where either death of everything is the possibility or the butterfly will be born. And that's the moment I think we're in right now.
Our minds, our bodies, our spirits, our earth. We all want to improve ourselves, our lives, and our world. Now, Wisdom Television shows you new ways to a happier, healthier, more fulfilled life. At home, at work, at play, around the world. Wisdom explores new ways of living that help you achieve a more balanced life. A better you. Embrace your life. Empower yourself. Enrich your world. Every day with Wisdom Television.
Don't go anywhere, I beg you. The moon you are looking for is inside you.
I think conferences like this are hugely valuable, providing that we're not singing to the choir. I mean, the title is Spirit in Business. What I think that really requires is for the attendees to be a genuine mix in enough numbers of the business community together with those who are not directly of the business community, who are more sort of spiritually religious oriented. That's the tough challenge here. What I have seen in this conference is where that has happened, where there's been that integration, real movement can take place, good things can happen. But there is still a them and us scenario being played out, which we need to transform. We've got to transform to go forward. Them being the evil empire of Wall Street and the business world, and us being the slightly holier than thou. You know, I've got my meditation practice, and really, you know, those people are dirty people because they're making lots of money. Well, maybe they are dirty people in some ways, or whatever that means, but you know, we've got to get over that. There's really good people in business. In fact, they're human beings like you and me. That's the point we need to remember. They've got hearts and souls. My personal view is that human beings are spiritual beings, whether we like it or not. And I think there's just degrees of spirituality, whatever spirituality means. But I think the challenge, though, of integrating spirituality into business is the challenge of having the courage to consciously take action based on one's spiritual values and beliefs, rather than forgetting that we're also spiritual beings at work as well as spiritual beings in our personal lives. So we might go to church, you know, on a Sunday, or go to the temple on a Friday evening, and then we think, well, we're being spiritual, and then somehow when we go to work, we're no longer spiritual. Well, I think that's a fallacy. Integrating spirituality into the daily work life of a human being, I think that's the biggest challenge. There's practical reasons why it's such a big challenge. One is that we get focused in on the business at hand, quote unquote. We're busy. We don't have enough time to reflect. And the challenge is to look for ways in which you can be spiritual during a business day. What does that mean? Well, I think what that means is being conscious of when I'm acting out of line with my own values. For example, my values are it's important to be honest, compassionate, sincere, authentic, caring, etc. I think those are spiritual values. Whatever religion or spiritual path you're on, they're sort of universal. How do those get played out in action at work during any given work day? That's the challenge. So when I observe myself being disrespectful, treating an employee without any care, being rude to them, being even flying off the handle, I check myself and I go, Michael, on the one hand, I say I'm on a spiritual path and I espouse those values. On the other hand, in practice, I just rip that person apart, verbally speaking. So I think that's just a very practical example of where by staying conscious, being committed to continually growing as a spiritual being all the time, regardless of whether I'm at home or work, then I can affect my behaviors and actions so that they are in alignment with my values. I'm not suggesting that we're going to end up with nirvana on planet Earth, but what I am suggesting is that there has to be, at the very least, a balance which acknowledges our faults and the things that we're not doing so well, and continually strives to improve. I think you have to face a reality, which is if you're in a business, in a firm, you can't always choose who you're with. In my company, there are people I don't choose to hang out with if I'm given a choice. There are people I don't particularly like. I strive to respect everyone in my company. And I also honor the fact that occasionally we have opportunities to be together as a community, and I put that over and above as a priority, whether or not I'm, going to want to spend time with someone. Being a community does not mean to say that you have to co-opt everyone and dragoon them to all thinking the same way. In fact, the opposite. I think a healthy community in business is one that acknowledges diversity completely in all its forms. It's an interesting concept, business as a community. It's actually becoming, I think, okay to talk about one's business as a community. I read about it more and more. So the company I'm now an owner of in the US, we call ourselves a community. We are a community. From the lowest paid person to the highest paid person, we all acknowledge that we're part of a community. I think the idea of business as a community is a very supportive idea. And I actually think that it has the potential, depending on the nature of the community, to really support and encourage people's spiritual development. Because again, what is spirituality? Is it not communing together, being in community, caring for each other, loving each other, and out of that comes great results. There is a basic communication skill that's really helpful whenever you want to influence anyone, which is called pacing, matching and mirroring. It's a technique that goes this way. If I want to influence you, the first thing that I need to do is to tune in to your particular mode of communication, to make you feel comfortable, to allow you to trust me, to allow you to think, wow, this guy's great, he's like me. Okay? Now, I know there's another side of it which might suggest that I'm suggesting you should be inauthentic by going into that mode with the other person, but it's actually not. It's respecting the other person, getting onto their wavelength in terms of their personality, the style of communication and so on. Once that happens and you have that trust and comfort, then you can move on to other things, and then you can influence more effectively, because we're in harmony, we're not in opposition. When I think about whether we're making progress, am I thinking globally? Then I would suggest that we are making progress, but human nature tends to focus on the negative more than the positive. When we think about ourselves, we think of our faults typically before we think of our virtues. So I think that it's very easy to think that we're not making progress because the focus tends to be on what's not working. But I actually believe that things are going in the right direction. There's a building movement or a kind of critical mass that's gathering around the world of people who really are actively interested in making the world a better place. I also think there's another factor involved here, which is that as that continues to grow, conversely, there's a reaction to that, in a sense, and it's much easier to see the bad things in the world being brought into greater relief than they might otherwise be brought into, because you're comparing the good with the bad. And it sounds a bit dramatic, but it's like the good's getting better and the bad's getting worse, and at some point there has to be some sort of dialectic resolution, and of course we hope it's a good one.
The mantra kind of changed a little bit. I have a current one going on that I got from a lama we had to dinner last week. Cycles of existence, ha ha ha! And it was a really good one.